The sound of laughter echoed through the pines, not mine, not my guests', but hers. Karen stood outside my cabin gate, clipboard in hand, announcing that she'd reserved my property for her 100 guests. My jaw clenched as the crowd cheered behind her like it was her kingdom. Before I tell you how I turned that humiliation into poetic justice, stay with me till the end. The morning sun slanted through the mountain pines, scattering light across my cabin's porch. It was the kind of morning that made silence feel alive, birds chattering, firewood crackling, the air cold enough to taste. My cabin sat at the edge of a private road, owned for generations, a refuge away from the HOA's endless noise. I had rebuilt it piece by piece after my father's passing, every plank, every fence post, every lock, all mine. But peace doesn't last long when arrogance lives next door. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, had been circling for weeks. She wasn't just nosy, she was entitled in ways that only power without empathy can breed. To her, rules were tools, and boundaries were challenges. She complained about my gate being too private, my lights being too dim, and even my silence being unneighborly. I ignored it all. Until that morning. I woke to a rumble of engines, buses, SUVs, and laughter rolling up my driveway. At first, I thought they'd taken a wrong turn. But then I saw her, Karen, standing tall in her tailored jacket, sunglasses flashing in the sunlight, clipboard pressed to her chest like a badge of authority. Behind her, people poured out, partygoers, families, children, all heading toward my cabin. When I stepped out, she turned and smiled. "Oh good, you're here," she said, as if I were her hired help. "The HOA has scheduled a retreat for our annual members' picnic. I put down your cabin as the venue." I stared at her, speechless. "You what?" Her grin widened. "You weren't using it this weekend, right? We have 100 people coming. It's for the community." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to believe it was a joke. But the sound of tables unfolding and speakers being set up said otherwise. The smell of food and perfume mixed with gasoline and arrogance. They were already claiming the lawn, setting chairs, even walking into my porch as if they owned it. I tried reason first. "Karen, you can't just claim my property. This is private land." She waved me off. "It's within the HOA's recreational zone map. It's technically part of the neighborhood's common boundary." That word, technically, hit me like a slap. She knew exactly what she was doing. The HOA's maps were old, but my deed was clear. She was banking on confusion, on intimidation, on me backing down like everyone else did. But I didn't move. Her tone sharpened. "If you're going to be difficult, I'll just have to file a violation report." The crowd watched, whispering, cameras raised like spectators at a show. My privacy, my peace, my home, turned into her stage. I felt my jaw tighten, the anger steady, slow burning. But I didn't shout. I turned, walked toward my porch, and closed the cabin door behind me. From inside I could still hear her voice commanding people, laughing, making herself the hero of her own illusion. I sat down, breathing through my fury. Every inch of this land held my family's history. The smell of pine tar from my father's hands, the grooves in the railing where he'd rested his tools. And now this woman wanted to erase it with her entitlement. Outside someone knocked. "Excuse me," a young man's voice said. "Where should we set up the tents?" Something inside me shifted, not rage, not revenge, but something sharper. Resolve. I looked out the window and saw them dragging equipment across the grass, their laughter echoing through the trees. Karen stood near the gate, arms folded, satisfied. That was when I decided. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to remind her, and everyone else, that some gates don't open for arrogance. By noon, her guests had filled the driveway. Cars lined the road, food tables covered the deck, and Karen strutted like a general at her parade. I stood by the gate, silent, waiting. When she looked up and saw me holding the keys, her smile froze. I locked the iron gate with a heavy clang. The crowd turned. Her eyes widened. "What do you think you're doing?" she barked. I said nothing. I just looked at her, calm, controlled, and turned the lock twice. The sound echoed like thunder across the clearing. She lunged forward. You can't trap people in here. I raised my hand. Oh, I'm not trapping anyone, Karen. I'm just making sure no one else comes in. Your 100 guests can enjoy the space they've already invaded. The murmurs began. People exchanged looks. Her control slipped, cracking like glass. I walked past her, slow and deliberate, and whispered just loud enough. You claimed my cabin. Now deal with it. And as I turned toward the porch, the laughter behind me began to fade, replaced by silence, confusion, and the first glimmers of embarrassment on her perfectly painted face. The game had only begun. By the time the sun began to sink behind the ridge, the laughter had turned uneasy. Karen's perfect afternoon was unraveling. Her grand community picnic had become a confused swarm of guests wandering around, realizing they were locked inside my property. I sat on the porch, arms crossed, watching the storm she'd created consume itself. She approached me again, this time without the swagger. You can't keep people in here like animals, she snapped, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Behind her, a man in a polo shirt whispered something about liability. I almost smiled. It was poetic. The same crowd that had cheered her now looked to her for answers. I stood up slowly, every motion deliberate. You said this was your event, I said evenly. Your guests, your responsibility. You wanted control. Now you have it. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She turned back to her crowd, trying to recover her composure. Everyone, please stay calm, she shouted, voice cracking. There's just a misunderstanding. But people had already begun calling rides, shouting at the buses that couldn't enter because of the locked gate. The noise grew, frustration, embarrassment, the breaking of illusions. I watched her pacing, clutching her clipboard like a shield, the color draining from her face. She had spent years intimidating others through rules and bylaws, but here, none of that power mattered. Inside my cabin, I poured coffee and waited. The smell of pine and smoke filled the air as I leaned by the window, watching the scene unfold. The sun dipped lower, painting everything in amber light. From this distance she looked small, a self-made monarch now stripped of her crown. Half an hour later, the HOA president arrived, a balding man named Ross, sweating through his shirt, phone in hand. He tried to reason with me from the other side of the gate. Look, John, he called out. This is just a mix-up. We can talk it out. I walked to the fence, calm and slow. A mix-up? I repeated. Ross, she booked my land, brought 100 people, and trespassed without consent. That's not a mix-up. That's theft, of space, of peace, of dignity. He rubbed his temples. We'll handle it. Just open the gate. I folded my arms. Not until they clean up the mess. Every single chair, every cup, every piece of trash. When my yard looks exactly the way it did this morning, then I'll open it. Karen's face turned red. You're humiliating me, she shouted. I met her eyes. No, Karen. You did that to yourself. A hush fell. Even the guests looked away, their eyes shifting between us like spectators of a reckoning. Slowly, people began picking up cups, folding chairs, gathering decorations. The noise softened to murmurs, the kind that only rise from shame. By dusk, the lawn was spotless again. I walked to the gate, keys in hand, and turned them slowly. The latch clicked, echoing like judgment in the quiet air. The crowd began to leave, heads down, muttering apologies. Karen stayed behind, her hands trembling as she held her clipboard, the same one she had used to claim my property that morning. You'll regret this, she whispered, her voice shaking. I tilted my head. Maybe. But at least I'll sleep in my own cabin tonight. She turned and walked away, the heels of her shoes clicking like brittle glass. The others followed in silence, their cars fading into the dark road below. When the last sound disappeared, I closed the gate again, gently this time. The stillness returned, soft and clean. The stars began to show between the branches. I leaned against the fence and exhaled deeply. The air smelled of pine and justice. Later that night, I received a notification, an HOA group message from Ross. Reminder: all future community events require written property consent. I laughed quietly. It was more than a message, it was a confession written in formal language. But I knew Karen wasn't done. Pride doesn't surrender easily. Somewhere behind her silence, another move was forming. And I would be ready for it. Morning came cold and clear. The air around the cabin felt lighter, freer, as if the pines themselves had exhaled. The chaos of the night before had dissolved into silence. Birds perched again on the railing, and sunlight crawled softly across the deck. But inside me, something still burned, not anger, but reflection. I brewed my coffee and stepped outside. The ground was littered with faint footprints from the night's exodus, small reminders of arrogance and its cost. The gate still stood locked, the metal cool under my fingers. For a long moment I stared at it, the barrier that had turned humiliation into truth. Later that afternoon, a quiet knock came at the cabin door. When I opened it, Karen stood there. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes swollen, not from rage this time, but something closer to shame. She held her clipboard to her chest like a relic of her old pride. "I came to apologize," she said softly. The words hung awkwardly between us, unsure of where to land. I overstepped. For a second I didn't answer. The silence stretched like the distance between who she was and who she was trying to become. Then I simply nodded. "You did." She looked down, nodding too, as if agreeing with a verdict she already knew. "I thought being in charge meant being right," she murmured. "But yesterday, everyone saw what I really was." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but the sting of recognition. "You didn't humiliate me. You showed me the mirror." I said nothing. There was nothing to add. Some lessons don't need to be preached, they just need to be felt. She placed the clipboard on my porch rail. "I'm resigning from the HOA board," she said quietly. "And I'll make sure the bylaws get updated. No one should ever misuse authority like that again." She hesitated before adding, "I'm sorry, John. Truly." When she left, I watched her walk down the gravel path. The sound of her footsteps faded slowly into the trees, softer now, humbled. Weeks passed. The HOA remained quieter than it had been in years. Meetings grew shorter, rules simpler, and for the first time, people smiled at each other without the weight of politics behind their eyes. My gate stayed where it was, closed when it needed to be, open when it felt right. One afternoon, I received a letter. It was from Karen. Inside was a photo of the entire HOA committee planting saplings near the community center, along with a handwritten note. "Sometimes gates are meant to keep arrogance out, not people." I read it twice, a faint smile breaking through the lines of my face. Maybe redemption didn't always come with punishment. Sometimes it arrived with understanding. That evening, I stood on my porch as the sun dipped low behind the ridge. The forest glowed gold, and the breeze carried the scent of pine and smoke. I unlocked the gate, just to hear the latch click open again, not as a symbol of anger this time, but as peace restored. The wind whispered through the trees like a prayer. I thought of my father, of the lessons he'd left in wood and earth. Respect isn't given through power. It's earned through boundaries. As night settled, the stars began to bloom across the dark. My cabin light flickered softly against the stillness. The world, for once, felt in balance again. Where pride had burned, humility now stood. And as I took one last look at the quiet road below, I whispered to myself, "Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the sound of a gate closing, and peace finally returning."